Hi everyone, my name is Kat and welcome back to the channel, Simple Music Theory. Specifically right now, this channel is focusing on simple music theory for guitar. In our last couple of videos, we've been talking about how to understand the notes on the fretboard, how to identify and label notes on the neck of the guitar. And today we're going to take the next step of foundational knowledge and start talking about scales. So if you think of music theory knowledge on the guitar like a pyramid, and this is the way that I understand it and the way that I'm going to be explaining it to you, you can think of the very bottom level of the pyramid as understanding the notes on the neck of the guitar. Because of course it's kind of hard to talk about notes and their relationship to each other and their patterns if you don't know what notes you're playing. So that's definitely the bottom level of the pyramid. But the way that I understand music theory, the next level of this pyramid is scales. So this is another really foundational concept that's going to be another basis for everything that we keep learning in future videos. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about scales. The first thing we're going to do, as always, is go over some definitions so we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to show you the pattern for the major scale, and you are going to learn 12 major scales today. And then we're going to talk a little bit about practicing and carrying this knowledge forward. So you're going to learn a lot today. I'm really excited, and this is a really important concept. So they're all important, aren't they? I feel like I say that a lot, but really, scales are a big one. So I'm really excited to talk about this with you all today. As always, let's start with definitions. I want to define two important terms for you today. The first term, unsurprisingly, is the term scale. So you can articulate this definition with varying levels of complexity, but I think the way that we can phrase it for the purpose of these videos is a certain sequence of notes. And you can play them going up, ascending, you can play them going down, descending, but a scale is a sequence of notes. And usually scales divide up an octave. So it's a sequence of notes that starts with a certain note and ends on that same note an octave higher. There are many different scales. Depending on how long you've been playing guitar or other instruments, you've probably heard of major scales, maybe minor scales, maybe you've heard of pentatonic scales, especially if you're someone who likes to practice soloing. So there's a lot of different ways to divide up that distance between octaves, as we talked about before in previous videos. And so there's a lot of different scales because there's a lot of different sequences of notes that you can use that provide different flavors and different colors. The second term I want to define for you today is key. So again, depending on how long you've played, you probably heard this term thrown about before, but a key is just the scale that a certain song or a piece of music is based around. We're not going to talk too much more about keys in this video or in the next few videos. We're going to really just focus on scales. And once we get to chords and we get to whole song constructions, we're going to talk more about keys. But I wanted to throw that definition out there for you today so you can see how closely bound key and scale is. And so that's something you can keep in the back of your mind as we keep moving forward with these videos. But those are two definitions, the most important of which for this video and the videos that directly follow this one is scale. We have a definition of scale. Now I'm going to teach you the music theory behind your first scale. If you've played for a little while, you probably already know some scales, but it's not always explained super clearly, especially to beginning musicians. So at least now you're going to understand a little bit of the theory behind it. And today, for the rest of the video, we're only going to be talking about major scales. The first reason we're focusing on the major scale is that, frankly, it's the most common, and most music is written in keys that are based on the major scale. But also, understanding the major scale is, in the way that I understand music theory and the way I'm going to be explaining it to you, is the first step in understanding how chords are built and in understanding every other scale, because you can look at other scales just as variations of the major scale, which is the way I look at it, which is the way that's easiest to me. So when I teach you this major scale today, I'm not just teaching you one useful skill. I hope that I'm laying the basis for a lot of useful skills. You got to get as much bang for your buck when it comes to learning, right? Anyway, I gave you the definition before of a scale as a sequence of notes linking one note to the same note an octave higher. When I tell you what the major scale is, I'm going to give it to you as a sequence of notes. Notes with a certain distance in between them. And how do we describe the distance between notes? We use whole steps and half steps. This is one reason I gave you this definition a few videos ago. In case you forgot, I'm going to put it on the screen. But we're going to describe the sequence of notes in terms of whole steps and half steps. So the distance between each of the notes that we play in a major scale. On the screen, you see a series of W's and H's representing whole steps and half steps. And in just a minute, I'm going to demonstrate this on guitar, and I hope you'll play along with me, and it's going to make a lot more sense, but stick with me. First, I want to talk about it just a little bit still as a conceptual idea. What this series of whole steps and half steps mean is that you start on any note on the entire neck, and then you move up a whole step and play that note. Move up a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and a half step. And then you'll have played a whole major scale. This is another thing I'm going to ask you to memorize. So the last things that we memorized, let's see, what do we have so far? We have the names of the open strings, but we had that awesome acronym that makes it easier. We had the AB/CDE/FG, but you know the alphabet, so you really just had to memorize the slashes. This, I want you to memorize this sequence of whole steps and half steps, but I'm going to give you another little memory trick that's going to make it really easy, and it's the memory trick I still say in my head every single time I play a major scale to this day, if I'm just practicing a scale by itself. So we see W's, H's, W's. You don't just say whole step, no. You say whole, half, whole, half. With the rhythm. It's so catchy. Beautiful, makes it so much easier to remember. So there's your memory tool. You can write this down somewhere so you can look at it later, make it a little bit easier to remember. But if you repeat that a few times to yourself, and in a second when we put it on the neck of the guitar, when we're practicing it on guitar, if you say that aloud to yourself, whole, half, whole, half, it's gonna help. You could also just think 2 W's half, 3 W's half, but that's less fun. A little less fun. I know that might have been a little bit odd because we don't usually think about distances between notes like that. We're usually focused on what the notes themselves are that we're playing, but I'm going to demonstrate it for you on guitar right now. I want you to play along with me, and I think after we practice on a few open strings, it's going to make a lot more sense. So keep that pattern in mind. I'm going to have it on the screen so that you can remember it. And remember, the first step is to start on any note on the entire neck. So we can really start anywhere, but to make it simple, let's start on the open E string, the low E. And now so this is the first note of the major scale, it's E, and that's why it's also called the E major scale, because it's the note that we're starting on, and remember we're going to end an octave higher, so E is also the note we're going to be ending on. Then remember, the first step of the pattern is a whole step. So I'm going to skip the first fret and I'm going to play the second fret. And then remember there's another whole step, so I'm going to play the fourth fret. And then there's a half step, so I'm going to play the fifth fret. Now remember there's 3 whole steps in a row, so I'm going to play the 7th fret, the 9th fret, and the 11th fret. And then the last one is a half step, so now I'm back to E. So I'm going to play it again with a little bit less commentary so you can hear the sound of it. Again, starting on open low E, whole, half, whole, half. You can, of course, play the same scale that we practiced today, descending. You would just have to flip that pattern around. And I'm going to be frank with you, I don't have that pattern memorized in reverse, although it's not that complicated. You just do 3 whole steps first and 2 whole steps second. But I just kind of visualize the first pattern and try to follow it back down. But just because I forgot to mention it earlier, the E major scale descending, you'd start on the high E, and then you go down half a step, and then whole step, half step, whole step, ascending and descending. That scale probably sounded familiar to you. Depending on your musical experience, it might have sounded super familiar to you. If you've ever played any other instruments, you probably learned to play the same scale on those other instruments. And it's also the singer's do, re, mi scale, so that might also be another reason that it sounded really familiar to you. You might be wondering, well, that was a little odd. You could have just given it to us in the note names, and then we could have practiced searching out those note names on the fretboard and gotten double the practice for the same amount of time. Bang for your buck. But I did not want to do that because I wanted you to focus on the relationship of notes in the major scale, because by learning that pattern of whole steps and half steps, you just learned every single major scale. You have the tools now to figure out what actual notes are in the E major scale. You could go back and play that scale again and say aloud the notes to yourself and figure out what notes are in that. Spoiler alert, we're going to do that at the end of this video, so don't worry about it right now. But you could do that because of the knowledge that we learned in the previous videos. But in this video, because we're learning it as a pattern of whole steps and half steps, you can now apply it to any note. You can start on any note, and you've now just learned 12 major scales. This is a reason I am so passionate and constantly reminding you that this is about learning, not memorization. All learning is repetition. All learning includes a certain amount of you have to remember stuff. We get it. You have to remember this pattern, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. But that's it. That's it, because if you understand the concepts in the previous video, you can always figure out what notes are in each major scale when you need to. And again, we're going to talk about more how to do that a little bit more efficiently, strategies for practicing that, but you can do it with just this pattern if you get nothing else from this video. Let me demonstrate for you again how to play the A major scale starting on the open A string. We're going to use that same pattern of whole steps and half steps. And this time we're going to start on the open A string. So remember, the first step is a whole step. We're on the second fret, and then we keep going. And we started and ended that scale on the A string. You might be wondering, okay, but still, couldn't you have said the fret numbers instead of the whole steps and half steps? Because that would be a lot easier to read and that would be faster. However, we don't have to start on the open strings. We can start on any fret anywhere. So let's start on the first fret of the D string. So let's see, what note is that? That's the note D sharp or E flat. And let's play that scale. So again, the first step is a whole step. So we're not playing the second fret this time. This time we're playing the third, and then the fifth, and then the sixth. And now we just played a different scale, starting on the note E flat. Like I said before, you now know 12 major scales, and using the knowledge from the previous videos, you're now able to figure out, without using any outside references, what the notes are in each of those major scales, which, as you can imagine, is going to be really important as we continue to talk about music theory, chords, keys, all that fun stuff. There's one other piece of knowledge that is going to help you name the notes of a scale. And the piece of knowledge that I want you to know is that every scale, when you write it out, includes every letter. What do I mean by that? I mean every single scale is going to include a note that's some form of A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Different scales are going to have sharps or flats attached to each one of those notes, but every single scale is going to have every letter represented. And that's important because that means that some scales only have sharps and some scales only have flats. And when you're talking about a specific scale, it is correct to use either a sharp or a flat. That is really confusing in words. It's much simpler to understand with an example. Let me show you the example of what I mean. Here's what I mean. Let's figure out what notes are in the G major scale. Can I just say, this is so cool. You don't even need to use Google. You don't need to look in a book. You don't need to do anything. You know the pattern, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And you know the piece of knowledge that I just gave you, that every letter has to be there. You're only going to use either sharps or flats. And now, with the knowledge that we've learned in just a couple videos, you can figure out what notes are in the G major scale. How cool is that? Anyways, that was a total side note. Let's get back to the question. So, if you're sitting at home doing this, this is an example. You can watch me. It's fine. I don't expect it. But later, when you're practicing, what I would recommend is that you have a piece of paper or your iPad or whatever, and you write down, starting with the note of the scale, and you write down every letter. So I'm going to put it on the screen right now. We're doing the G major scale. So we're going to start on G, and then we just write every letter until we get back to G. So G, A, B, C, D, E, F, back to G. you were doing the B major scale, you'd start on B, etc. Okay, so what notes are in the G major scale? Well, luckily, how handy, there's an open G string. So let's start on that string. This is G. And then let's see what the second note of the scale is. So we go up a whole step, excuse me. Let's go up a whole step. And that's the note A, because remember from previous videos, the first fret would either be G sharp or A flat. So the second note of the scale is A. Now we have another whole step, and we know that's the note B. Now we have a half step. That's the note C. Another whole step, D, another whole step, E, another whole step. And now this is where we get cooking. This is where things get interesting. So I'm playing the 11th fret of the G string. And so you learned from our previous videos, that's the note we can either call F sharp or G flat. And when you're talking about notes just willy-nilly, when you're just practicing notes on the neck, for example, I wanted you to practice with both names, and there's not one that's correct. You just can call it either, and it's good to get used to calling it both. However, we are now in the context of a specific scale, so there is a correct name for this note, and the way that you know is remember what I told you before. Every scale includes every letter. If we called this G flat, not only would the scale become redundant and we'd have two G's, and that's confusing, but we'd also lose an F. There would be no note called F anymore, and that can't happen. So we know that the correct name for this note in this context, in the context of the G major scale, can only be F sharp. So if you're writing it down on a piece of paper, you would now add the little sharp sign to the F, and then we have a half step, and we're back on G. So let me play that whole thing again for you, because I also want you to get used to hearing it and get used to that sound. And that's going to be something really good for you when you're practicing too. So here's the G major scale again. With that beautiful F sharp towards the end. You might be wondering why it's a rule that every scale has to have every letter name in it. And for an instrument like guitar, it doesn't seem to make as much sense. However, depending on your experience, if you've ever played an orchestral instrument, or I guess a woodwind, I don't know, I don't play those instruments, or if you play piano, when that type of written music reports the key of the song to you, it reports it by telling you which notes are always sharped or flatted. So for example, if in that example we just went over in the G major scale, if you called F sharp G flat, then you would have a musical staff that flats G's, but also we're in the key of G, so that makes no sense. Listen, if that brief explanation made no sense to you, then throw it out the window. It doesn't matter. You don't need it. I just wanted to tell you in case you're interested, and depending on your playing experience, maybe that little interlude made some sense to you. Technically, guitar can also play scores written like that, but it's honestly not the most efficient way of reporting music for the guitar, so it's not very common. But there's a little musical tidbit for you in case you were curious. Totally irrelevant to everything else we're doing, so don't worry too much about it. With what we learned in this video and in the previous videos about the notes on the neck of the guitar, you have the tools to say what notes are in every single major scale, which again is going to be so important as we keep talking. We start talking about chords, we talk about songs and how songs are constructed. You could tell me right now, if you wanted to, the notes of the E major scale, F major scale, F sharp major scale, G major scale, A major scale, B flat major scale, B major scale, C major scale, D major scale, E flat major scale, E major scale, F scale. Yes, I did go over E major. Okay, yeah, that's all 12. You could tell me the notes of all 12 of those major scales right now. Is that what I want you to practice? Absolutely not. I do not think that you should do that. I think it would be tiring. I think it would be kind of boring, and I don't think it would be useful. I think different instruments lend themselves to different things and different methods of practice. And if you were learning another instrument, like my other favorite instrument, piano, or some other instruments, I might have a different recommendation for you. For an instrument like guitar, especially if it's your first or primary instrument, I do not think it's a useless strategy for you to sit here and go over 12 major scales and try to memorize what notes are in each of them. I just don't think that's an effective use of your time. Of course, once you get to a certain level, once you've been playing for a certain amount of time, and especially if you decide to pick up another instrument, and depending on the layout and the strengths of that instrument, you will eventually learn the notes that are in the 12 major scales, and you'll learn them with a certain amount of speed. And way later, we're going to be talking about some tools like the circle of fifths, if you've ever heard of that, that provide some really useful resources for remembering which sharps and flats are in which scales, and that can be really helpful. However, for right now, I'm going to give you two pieces of advice of what I want you to focus on. The first thing I want you to focus on is to pick like 2 or 3 easy scales that you just practice a lot because they're easy to remember, and really get those under your fingers and really get those in your mind, what notes are parts of those scales. 2 easy scales that you could start with is the G scale, because we just practiced it together, so you have a great example of it. It's easy to practice it on the open string to both reinforce that pattern of whole notes and half notes, and to also practice naming the notes of the scale. And that only has 1 accidental, so F sharp is the only strange note in that scale. So that's kind of an easy one to remember. Another one is the C major scale. Now that's going to feature a lot in the next video, which is why I didn't focus on it too much in this video, but that is a very common beginner scale because it has no accidentals. What I mean by beginner scale, not that it's for beginners, I just meant that it's a very common scale to be taught as your very first scale because it's easy to understand, it's easy to remember. No accidentals, no sharps or flats, all natural notes. So the C scale and the G major scale are both easy scales to practice and easy scales to remember what notes are a part of those. So you could start there and practice those until you really get them, and then maybe slowly add 1 or 2 other scales that are pretty easy to remember. But how do you figure out what scales to add? Well, here's my second piece of advice, which is to use scales from the songs that you practice. So different genres have different standards, you could say, I guess. They have different keys that tend to be very common. In the same way that if you play piano, certain composers tended to use a lot of very specific keys. Looking at you, Chopin. That's what I mean. I'm actually just calling out Chopin. If you got that joke, I appreciate you. Anyway, certain genres have specific keys that they tend to use a lot, as well as music that tends to be written for specific instruments. So the music that's specifically written for guitars will tend to cluster around the same keys as opposed to music that's written for, I don't know, an oboe or something. Therefore, what I would much rather you do, rather than just slamming out 12 major scales, some of which are super weird and hard to remember, I would much rather you take the key of a song that you're learning and practice the scale that is associated with that song. How do you figure out the key of the song that you're learning? We're going to talk about this way more in future videos, but that is far above where we are right now. So I'm going to give you 2 hints. The first way to figure out the key of the song you're learning is typically on websites like Ultimate Guitar, or depending on what tutorial you're watching, they'll say the key, and that can be super helpful. So if they say this song's in the key of G, that's a great opportunity to practice your G major scale before you play the song. The second method is by no means foolproof, and we're going to learn how to actually figure out the key of the song later, but that is really way too complicated for right now. So the method that my guitar teacher gave me in one of my first few lessons, which honestly does work like 80% of the time, especially for pop songs and rock songs, is look at the first chord in the song or look at the last chord. And honestly, that's probably the key. A lot of songs in the key of C, especially pop songs, especially rock songs, start on C. Again, by absolutely no means foolproof, and you'll learn later how to actually figure it out. But for right now, especially if you're a beginning player, that is plenty for you. So if you start playing a song that starts on D, you can practice the D major scale before you start playing that song. And that's a really great opportunity to both remind yourself of what notes are in a scale. So you would write out all the letters D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. You would start on the open D string, play that pattern of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Fill in which notes are either sharps or flats, because you have to remember, okay, should I make this a sharp or should I make that next note a flat? And you'll be able to figure it out, just like the example we did earlier. And then you can play that scale again, listen to how it sounds, and either try playing it over the song or play the song immediately after, and you'll see how that scale sound kind of slots in. That's a really great way to practice these scales in a musical context. And it's going to directly connect to what we're going to do later, which is seeing how chords come from scales, and all these other exciting things. If you do this exercise, you're going to find really quickly that you are practicing the exact same 4 or 5 scales every time you learn a new song. And every once in a while, you're going to be like, oh my God, what key is this song written in? What is this? But the rest of the time, it's going to be like the same 4 or 5. And that's so awesome, because the 5 that you're repeating all the time, you're going to be repeating them so much that it's going to become a little bit easier, a little bit faster every time. And you're going to start seeing some more patterns and how the scales relate to each other, which is really cool. And it's also going to be really interesting for you, because if you get a song that's in a totally unexpected key that you've never played before, you can also think about, I wonder why this was written in this key. Did it have to do with the singer's voice? Is there another instrument in this song that's kind of unexpected, and maybe that's why it made more sense to write it in this key? Are there covers that do the song in a different key? Did the original singer do it in a crazy key, but most people who cover it do it in a different key? That could be a really interesting thing for discussion. You don't have to do any of that. You could just practice these scales, but something to think about, a little food for thought. I use this method to this day. I would say there are 6 or 7 major scales that I know like that. You tell me the major scale, I'll tell you the notes that are in it without even blinking. Then there are probably three major scales where I'd have to think for a second, but I could still do it in my head and tell you. And I'll tell you, there's 1 or 2 major scales that I've maybe encountered twice ever, and I have to really stop and go, okay, wait, what note is that? Your goal is not to get all 12 at the exact same speed and to know all of them. I assume that you're not a music theory academic. The purpose of this music theory is to help with understanding the songs you learn and to possibly help you write your own music. And for those purposes, I think it's enough to have some scales that you're really comfortable with, that are really common in the genre of music that you like to play. And as long as you have the tools and the skills to figure out the notes that are in all 12 scales when you need them, I think that's a good goal to strive for. And that's the place that I've reached, and I'm really happy with that level of knowledge. We're going to do the summary in just a second, but first, you might be thinking, okay, I've either taken lessons before, I've been watching other YouTube videos, or I've been learning from a book like it's the 1900s, and that is not how I learned to play scales. I learned scales that look a lot more like this. We are going to talk about that in the next video. Don't you worry. We're going to talk about taking that pattern that we learned today and making it horizontal and making it more realistic to play, because of course playing like this is not very efficient. This is not how you would typically play this scale in a musical concept. The reason that we played the scale like that today is because I really want you to get the pattern in your head and under your fingers. And I think it's a lot easier to understand conceptually the first time around. Vertically, when we're just seeing the sequence of notes, we can visually see that it's an ascending pattern. That's why we focus on that today, but don't you worry, in the next video, we're going to be playing scales that if you've played scales before, you're going to be way more familiar with those shapes. It's time for the summary in this video about the major scale. Since it was our first time talking about scales, we defined 2 terms. We defined scale, which at its most basic can be defined as a sequence of notes, and it connects one note to another note an octave higher. We also defined key, which is the scale a piece of music is based on. This video is focused on the major scale, so we learned the pattern that's used in the major scale. And we describe patterns of scales in whole steps and half steps. And so the pattern that the major scale follows is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole, half, whole, half. That means you can start on absolutely any note, and whatever note you start on will be the name of the scale. So if you start on E, it's going to be the E major scale. And then you play 7 more notes with this distance in between each note. So you go a whole step up from E, and then a whole step up from that note, and then a half step up from that note, and so on. And that would be the E major scale, or the major scale of whatever note you started on. We then talked about how knowing this pattern gives you the ability to figure out for yourself what notes are in every major scale without using an outside reference. How cool is that? And the piece of knowledge that you need to know in order to do that is that every single scale includes every letter name. And to illustrate this as a reminder to you, I wrote down some examples. So here you can see the C major scale written out. Remember, that's the scale without any accidentals, so none of these notes are sharps or flats. And in between each of those notes, here's a reminder, there's a whole step distance, a whole step distance, a half step distance. So there's this pattern applied. In the G major scale, which we figured out in this video, remember the only accidental is on the F, and it's an F sharp, not a G flat. And then we did not talk about the F major scale in this video. For brownie points, you can go and figure it out right now. But the F major scale, the reason I wrote it on this paper as a reminder in the summary of this video, summarizing something we didn't do, I just wanted this written down for you so you can see what a flat might look like in a certain scale. This note, which we normally can call either A sharp or B flat, in the context of the F major scale, cannot be called A sharp because then you'd have two A's and you'd be missing a B. That's why here's an example of a scale with a flat in it. That was the summary. That was scales. That was the major scale. We are going to continue talking about scales in the next few videos, and especially in the next video, we're going to really drill down, talk a lot about the C major scale, and we're going to talk about playing scales in a way that might be more familiar to you, so horizontally across strings instead of just staying on one string. But for this video, I hope that really helped hammer down the concept of major scales. I'm so excited for you in this 10 or 20 or 30 minutes or however long it ends up being, because I never stop talking. You learned 12 major scales, and however long this video ended up being, that is a pretty good ratio of investment of time to learning, I think. Okay, I have spoken enough today. I hope that you learned a lot. I hope that if you have any questions whatsoever, if anything I said at all was unclear, that you will leave a comment, because I want to answer those comments. I want to help you. I want to make these videos clear and continue to make them clear. So any comments or feedback you have will help me do these videos even better. And if you're excited for the next video, then you better subscribe so that you know when it's coming. And until then, practice a lot of guitar, okay? Bye!